Well, Paul, if we could move on to talk about obviously a massive issue for the NHS and for our sector of law is, of course, maternity injury claims, brain injuries to children, sadly, at the time of childbirth, which we know is a huge issue for the NHS. It's a huge issue for society. It's only 13% of all claims against the NHS, but it's actually 64% of the total value of the compensation being paid. So it's a massive issue. If the NHS can, A, reduce the number of claims or reduce the cost, it's going to have a huge impact on everyone, in particular, of course, the poor families affected by these issues. So if we just talk about that for a moment, where do you see perhaps progress that could be made in these maternity injury claims?
Absolutely. I mean, and you're spot on in terms of your analysis. And it does seem to me that we've got to get back to the root causes here, which is back to maternity wards and what's going on. And I think it's been really disappointing this year to see the number of investigations being launched yet again into some of this, and also the number of maternity wards that are being rated inadequate by the CQC. So I think we've got a real problem, and that is the root cause, because whilst we haven't got safe wards and children being born in safe conditions, babies being born in safe conditions, we're going to have more and more problems, which leads, sadly, sometimes to those most extreme and very expensive cases, which cost huge amounts of money in terms of the litigation and the cost of care that will arise from that, quite legitimately. It seems to me.
Yeah, and obviously the government has put some initiative into this. We've got HSSIB. We've also got now the MNSI, Maternity and Newborn Safety Investigation Unit. So there's some government initiatives going into this, but I kind of think they're looking at this at the wrong end of the telescope, as it were. So they're investigating very hard after the event, and like you say, not investing before the event. And the blame, as it were, seems to be passed on to the families, that they're a burden on the state, and they're costing the state a lot of money because of course, the way the claims are made. And of course, the claims have to be made on the basis of future care being provided by private sector employees employed by the families. And that does cost £300,000, £400,000 a year and so on. There's a lot of talk about having a tariff scheme or a no-fault scheme. What's your thoughts on that?
I think we're open to the discussion about that. I mean, this is an issue that rears its head sort of every generation, it seems to me, of discussions about moving to some sort of no-fault compensation arrangement. And I think we should explore that. I'm not against exploring it. I think often comparisons are made with other countries such as Sweden, Norway, etc. And we need to bear in mind the context of the difference of some of those countries, where they have a much higher level of taxation, a much higher level of care and support that's provided to families, which is the underpinning issue in all of this. So, yes, if people are to, they were to be compensated to the same level that they would get now through the courts, then it'd be hard to argue against that. My fear is that actually they won't get that, and they will be thrown back onto the state, onto an already under-resourced NHS and care system, which is already struggling with massive backlogs, to then deal with these families. Well, how would that work? It seems to me they would be at the back of the queue. And actually, there is a moral obligation here, it seems to me, in terms of the wrong that was caused to those families and to that poor child that was injured, however it was at birth, that actually the state should take responsibility for that and not, as you say, just push it back onto the family and say, well, there's a queue there, get in the back of the queue. That just doesn't seem morally right to me at all. And it's right that families are properly compensated for that now. And if there is to be an alternative, then it must be at least as good.
Yeah, absolutely. And the critics of our current scheme always seem to come up with the same jurisdictions. So Norway, Sweden, Japan, New Zealand. 3 of those got very tiny population. Norway, obviously, a very wealthy country with the oil wealth and so on. Its benefit system is very generous. So, yes, you could give a tariff award and then pay the compensation, as it were, through extra benefits. But they've got the ability to do that. Japan, again, also very, very highly advanced welfare benefit scheme. But what we don't have in this country, as you say, is a really strong state support scheme for those families. And it's almost as if we're saying to those families, well, you're very expensive to the country, therefore we're going to punish you first. And we're throwing away hundreds of years of tort law just because they've become a very expensive issue, it seems, for the politicians. So, I agree. It seems really unfair. Yes, the other issue, of course, driving costs is the cost of carers, which has gone up tremendously, even just the last 6 years, 7 years since Brexit, obviously, and since COVID. We've had massive increase in wage inflation for carers. And then, secondly, of course, there's been massive medical advances for children with brain injuries, and they now, thankfully, do live a lot longer, and they live a lot better quality lives. But of course, that comes with an expense. So yes, we hear a lot about the future liabilities of the NHS being £82 billion for these claims in particular. Of course, that's spread over the next 60 years of these children's lives. And I think often the media sort of put this figure out there of 100 billion or whatever future costs, but not explain to the public that this is spread over the next 80 years. So it is a tricky one. Yeah, I don't get the sense that it's ever going to be reformed with being cost neutral. It's always going to be the families are going to suffer if this comes in.
I think that's absolutely right. And it seems to me, and you are talking about, and it is right that it is large sums of money. And if the government is serious about trying to reduce those large sums of money, then actually making some investments up front in maternity services and improving them would actually reduce the harm for everyone. Because actually, regardless of the cost, no one wants to be having, brain injured children, etc., that have harmed at birth, the trauma to the parents, to the mother, all of that. And all of that cost, if I can describe it as that, which you can't actually put a figure on, is also something that just doesn't get talked about in all of this. So it seems to me, actually, investment up front, at the front end of these services, would reap so many more rewards downstream.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, it's CQC going in, finding things, and often these are not surprises, perhaps to some local clinicians, perhaps, or local midwives. There have been many incidents. I won't repeat them all, but there have been units where bad cultures have developed, and that's been left to go on for some years. Now, NHS Resolution or perhaps some other government body could have noted the number of claims and could have picked up on that earlier. So is actually the NHS doing enough in terms of surveillance to monitor what's going on with their units?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it seems to me, an abundance of data out there. The NHS has no end of data. Of course, finding patterns in that data is not always straightforward. I accept that. But I can't believe that actually that there isn't soft and hard intelligence out there that could be better used more quickly to identify trusts that are not performing well, that actually should be addressed more quickly than they are now.
Yeah. And I suppose also, I mean, I'm pleased that HSIB has come along. There have been campaigners looking at this saying, why can't the healthcare industry have something similar to the aircraft industry? So obviously, when an aircraft crashes, obviously immense trauma and financial losses and all the rest of it. And then that will be analysed very carefully in a detailed report by air safety investigation bureaus, etc. There is an argument to say every single one of these cases needs to be analysed in minute detail, not just skimmed over, and then disseminated. Could we have more dissemination of learning as to problems? And it can be human factors, it can be resource factors, but I think there's a lot more could be done there.
I think you're right, and actually I welcome the initiatives that you just talked about in terms of trying to improve the overall quality of investigation that is going on now in these areas. That must be a good thing. And I think there is learning to be had from, highly critical, industries where there's, safety is a massive thing, like nuclear industry, rail industry. There is definitely things that can be learned from that and improvements that can be made. And the optimist in me says that is beginning to happen. I think it will take time. What we can't underestimate is the lack of funding that could be related to some of this. I think that is a real challenge. But nevertheless, I think this is a positive step forward, and it must bring benefits in time in terms of overall safety management, which I think is what we really do lack here as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like you say, I am optimistic. The fact that even we've got HSIB, MNSI, the fact that we've got these specialist units, well, that's happened in the last 5 years or so. 10 years ago, we didn't have them. So at least there's that positive development. It is going to take time, just like the duty of candour has taken time to filter through. But I'm hopeful this is going to reduce the number of incidents. And I think you raised a really good point about the ripple effect, as it were. So yes, there's a child who's got a terrible injury, but yeah, the impact on the parents, their careers, the impact on siblings, on grandparents, that's all overlooked when the lawyers just look at the pounds and pence of the case. There's a massive impact, obviously, on every single family.
Well, I've read a statistic recently about the number of women who go into hospital to give birth, which should be a joyous moment of life. The number that come out with PTSD. I mean, it's one of the highest ways. One of the fastest ways to get PTSD in this country is to give birth.
Yeah,
I mean, there must be something fundamentally wrong when that is the case.
Yeah, and that leads to other problems. I mean, people opting for home birth, which, if they're not properly supported, can be more dangerous than a hospital birth. So
absolutely,
we need to make women feel that hospitals are safe and supportive, and it doesn't matter if you go in on a Friday night. The care is going to be 24/7, and it's going to be brilliant at weekends. But that's going to take a lot of funding and organisation as well to get that right.
But it's about, I see that funding as investment rather than as money that goes in as a cost. If we saw it as an investment, I think we'd reap the benefits that we've just been talking about.
Yeah. I think the other point in that also is that it's going to take a long time, because obviously in our department we're dealing with cases that occurred in the 2010s or whatever. Some people will have an injury to a child, and for whatever reason, they don't bring a claim immediately. There are some families that come to us within weeks of the injury happening. Other families are intimidated by the whole system and don't bring a claim. So we're instructed by people in relation to injuries that happened in 2006, 2009 even, and they've struggled on trying to cope for themselves. So I think even if we do really good change right now, there's still going to be a lot of cases coming through the system. It's going to take a long time for costs actually to reduce.
Absolutely. I agree entirely. I mean, these things do take so long. So absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.